I was 20 years old when this happened, living in a quiet rental house just outside a small Midwestern town. Nothing about that evening felt unusual at first. I had finished my shift at the grocery store, grabbed something simple for dinner, and was planning to spend the night catching up on a few assignments. It was one of those calm, uneventful nights where you don't expect anything at all to happen. The sun was already going down, and most of the houses on my street were settling into that soft, early evening quiet that happens when families are eating or winding down. I remember sitting at my small kitchen table, scrolling on my phone, half listening to the local news on TV. It was mostly weather updates, a reminder about road construction, and something about the high school basketball team making regionals. Completely normal stuff. I wasn't stressed, I wasn't distracted, and I wasn't dealing with anything out of the ordinary. My life at that time was steady, predictable, and honestly kind of boring. The house itself was nothing special: 2 bedrooms, older carpeting, a slightly creaky hallway, and a porch light that flickered when it rained. It was the kind of place you could walk through in the dark without bumping into anything because you knew every corner. I had lived there for almost a year, long enough to feel comfortable, but not long enough for it to ever feel like a home. Still, nothing about it ever made me uneasy. Not until that night. While I was eating, I noticed something small, something I brushed off immediately. The front door, which I was sure I had locked earlier, had a faint draft coming from the bottom edge. I remember glancing at it, thinking maybe the wind had picked up, or the door frame had shifted again like it sometimes did in older houses. It didn't seem like a big deal. I didn't even get up to check it right away. I just made a mental note to push the deadbolt in a little harder before going to bed. A few minutes later, when I turned the TV volume down, I thought I heard something outside. Not a crash or anything dramatic, just a small, quick sound, like someone's shoe scuffing lightly against the porch. It was faint enough that I questioned whether it was real or just background noise from the TV. My porch didn't have loose boards, and it never made sounds like that unless someone stepped on it. I remember pausing, listening, and then shrugging it off. Maybe it was a delivery truck passing by or a neighbor closing their car door. I had no reason to assume anything was wrong. But for some reason, that tiny sound stuck with me. Not in a dramatic way, just enough that my brain kept replaying it while I ate. A small, quiet scuff. Quick. Light. Almost like someone was shifting their weight. At the time, I didn't know why that detail mattered. I just remember thinking it didn't belong to the ordinary rhythm of my neighborhood. And later, I would realize it was the first sign, the very first hint, that someone had stepped onto my porch who didn't belong there. I was renting that house because it was cheap, close to work, and far enough from the main highway that I didn't hear traffic all night. The neighborhood was quiet in a way that felt almost predictable. Same people walking their dogs, same porch lights turning on at the same time every evening, same delivery trucks rolling through around noon. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, and that was honestly what I liked about it. I wasn't looking for excitement back then. I just wanted a simple routine. The house sat at the end of a short, dead-end road. 5 houses total. Mine was the second oldest, with a narrow driveway and a small patch of yard that I barely kept up with. There was a row of tall pines behind the back fence, and when the wind pushed through them, it made the kind of steady, low rushing sound that could put you to sleep. Inside, things were plain, thin walls, an outdated kitchen, and a hallway that echoed more than it should have. But I was used to all of it. After almost a year, nothing inside that place ever surprised me. It was early winter, and the evenings got darker much faster. By 5:30, the roads were already dim, and by 6, my whole street felt like it had settled into its nighttime silence. On that particular evening, I remember the air feeling colder than usual. Not freezing, but sharp enough that the windows fogged a little at the corners. The porch light across the street flickered twice, the way it did every night before finally staying on. It was all routine. I was at home because I only worked morning shifts at the grocery store during that period. My days ended early, and I rarely went anywhere after work. I didn't have many friends in town, and most of my family lived a couple of hours away. So evenings were usually just me, my dinner, and whatever noise the TV made in the background. That day wasn't any different. There were few people in my life at that time worth mentioning. My coworker, Megan, who lived on the other side of town. my older brother, who called once a week to check in, and my landlord, who only showed up when he needed to fix something he probably should have replaced years ago. None of them had anything to do with what happened that night, but they were the closest thing I had to regular contact. Inside the house, everything felt normal. The kitchen light hummed faintly like it always did. The heater clicked every few minutes. The fridge made that low buzzing sound it made when the motor kicked on. It wasn't a creepy house, just an old one with typical noises. If anything, the familiar sounds made the place feel steadier, like I always knew what to expect. Nothing in the environment gave any warning. Nothing suggested danger, or even the slightest reason to be on edge. I was just going through my routine in a house I knew well, on a street where nothing unusual ever happened. At least, that's what I believed then. The first thing that pulled me out of my normal routine that night was a small sound coming from the front porch. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, quick tap, like someone accidentally brushing a shoe against the wooden step. At first, I didn't react. My neighborhood was peaceful, but it wasn't completely silent. Sometimes stray cats wandered around. Sometimes a delivery driver stepped onto the wrong porch before checking the address. Small noises weren't unusual, but this one caught my attention because of the timing. It happened right after I turned the TV volume down. Almost like I only heard it because the house suddenly got quiet. I waited for another sound, but nothing followed. No footsteps walking away, no movement on the gravel, no engine starting. Just silence. A little too long, a little too still. I tried to focus on my food again, but something about that single tap didn't settle right. I remember glancing toward the front door, watching the bottom edge, where the faint draft had been earlier. The hallway that led to the door was dim, and for a second, the house felt larger than it usually did. Emptier, too. A minute later, I heard another noise. This one was softer, almost like someone shifting their weight slowly on the other side of the door. Not stepping, just leaning. Wood creaked in a way I didn't recognize. Houses make noises all the time, but this didn't feel like part of the structure. It felt controlled, like pressure being applied intentionally. I stood up from the table listening. My heart wasn't racing yet, but it was beating heavier than before. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the cold weather was tightening the wood. Maybe the mail I picked up earlier hadn't let the door close as smoothly as it should have. I walked to the entryway and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dim glow from a single streetlight outside and the empty stretch of my porch. Still, the quiet felt different. Thicker. I stepped back and reached for the deadbolt. It was already locked, but I pushed it again just to be sure. The door nudged slightly in the frame, like something had been pressing against it from the outside. The movement was small, but it was enough to make me freeze. I stood there, hands still on the lock, waiting for another sound. And then I heard it, a faint, steady exhale. Not from inside the house. From the other side of the door. It stopped almost the moment I noticed it, like whoever was making it realized they were too close. I backed away slowly, feeling an edge of unease that hadn't been there minutes before. I told myself it could have been wind slipping through the small gap under the door, but wind doesn't sound like a person breathing. I turned off the TV so I could hear better. For a few seconds, the whole house felt unnaturally quiet. Then another noise came, this time from the side of the house. Like someone brushing against the siding as they moved along the wall. That was the moment when I realized something was wrong. Something or someone was out there. And they weren't leaving. The sound against the side of the house wasn't loud, but it was enough to make every muscle in my body tense. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was slow, steady movement, like someone brushing a jacket or sleeve along the wall as they walked. I stepped back toward the kitchen, trying to keep my footsteps quiet even though I didn't fully understand why yet. All I knew was that I didn't want whoever was outside to hear me. I grabbed my phone from the table, but I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I kept listening. The sound moved from the side of the house toward the back, dragging lightly over the siding. When it reached the corner, it stopped. Completely. The sudden silence felt worse than the noise itself. It was like the person realized I might have heard them. My house had 2 doors, the front door and a small back door near the laundry area. When the noise stopped, I found myself staring toward the hallway that led to the back. I didn't want to go near it, but I also couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was standing right outside. I took a few steps toward the back hall, keeping the lights off so I wouldn't cast any shadows through the blinds. The air felt heavier back there, colder too. I stood a few feet from the back door and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then the doorknob clicked lightly. Just one small, careful turn. My whole body froze. It wasn't a full twist. More like someone testing it, checking whether it was locked. The knob moved again, slower this time, as if the person didn't want to make noise, but couldn't help the metal clicking. I backed up immediately. My breathing felt tight, like my lungs didn't have room to expand. There was no doubt now someone was trying to get inside, and they were being deliberate about it. I moved toward the living room, unsure if I should stay quiet or make noise to let them know I wasn't asleep or distracted. Part of me wanted to call the police right then, but another part worried that if the person outside heard me talking, they might panic and try harder to get in. Then I heard something from the front porch again. Footsteps. Slow ones. It felt impossible, like the same person was at both doors. But the steps were clear, unmistakable. Someone was on the porch again, pacing lightly back and forth. Floorboards creaked under their weight, steady and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. I stood in the middle of the house, no lights on, holding my phone, listening to footsteps behind one door and a doorknob moving at the other. I didn't know which direction to watch. Every window felt exposed. Every hallway seemed like a bad place to stand. That was the moment it fully hit me. I wasn't imagining anything. I wasn't being paranoid. Someone was circling my house, trying to figure out a way inside. And for the first time that night, I realized how truly alone I was. The footsteps on the front porch stopped so suddenly that the silence felt louder than the noise had. I stood in the middle of the living room, gripping my phone, trying to decide which door the person was at now, the front or the back. My pulse felt heavy in my ears. I didn't want to move, but standing still felt just as dangerous. Then, without warning, the back door shook. One hard jolt, like someone threw their shoulder into it. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. The door rattled in its frame, not enough to break, but enough to tell me the person wasn't just testing locks anymore. They wanted inside. Another hit. A third. Each one faster. I backed down the hallway toward my bedroom. The house felt too small. There wasn't anywhere safe to stand. Every door suddenly felt thin. Every window felt exposed. I kept telling myself to call 911, but the thought of speaking out loud while someone was only a few feet away made my throat tighten. The next hit against the back door was the hardest one yet. Something cracked, maybe the paint, maybe the old wood around the lock. That sound snapped me out of my panic. I turned and ran. I grabbed my bedroom door, shut it quietly, and locked it. Then I pushed my dresser against it, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold onto the wood. The room went dark except for the weak glow from the digital clock on my nightstand. That's when I finally called 911. I whispered my address, trying not to let my voice shake too much. The operator kept telling me to stay calm, to stay on the line, to stay where I was. I could barely hear her because a new noise started, soft footsteps moving across my porch again. Then the front door handle twisted. Slow. Careful. Like someone trying not to make noise. The operator must have sensed something in my silence. She kept asking, "Is the person still there? Are you in a safe room?" I didn't answer. I was watching the shadows move under the gap of my bedroom door. A floorboard in the living room creaked, one of the ones that only made noise when someone heavy stepped on it. Another step followed. Then another. Slow, unhurried. The person was inside the house. I pressed myself against the far wall behind the bed, holding the phone so close I could feel the heat from the screen. The operator kept speaking, but I barely heard a word. Every sound in the house was suddenly sharp and clear. Footsteps in the hallway. They stopped right outside my bedroom. The doorknob moved. Just a small turn. Testing. Checking. Then the person leaned into the door. A dull thud sounded through it, shaking the dresser slightly. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The operator said officers were already on their way, but my house was a 10-minute drive from town. 10 minutes felt impossible. The person pushed on the door again, harder this time. The dresser shifted a fraction of an inch. I heard the faintest exhale from the other side.
Calm.
Controlled. Like they weren't in a hurry at all. I didn't look away from the doorknob. If it turned even slightly, I was ready to crawl under the bed or out the window. Anything to get away. For a moment, everything went silent.
No footsteps. No breathing.
Just thick, heavy quiet. And then, sirens in the distance. The footsteps outside my door moved quickly this time, heading down the hallway as the sirens grew louder. He was leaving, but he wasn't running. He walked out of my house like he knew exactly where every piece of furniture was. Like he had been inside before. When the police finally arrived, the house felt painfully quiet again. The officers moved through each room with their flashlights, calling out clear every few seconds. I stayed outside on the porch with one of them because my hands were still shaking too hard to trust myself to walk around inside. My front door was standing wide open, and the cold air from outside pushed into the house like it was claiming the space back. The officer who stayed with me kept asking questions: what I heard, how long it lasted, whether I had seen the person. I answered as best I could, but the whole time my eyes were stuck on the dark doorway, expecting someone to step out again. After about 15 minutes, one of the officers called for the others. He had found something near the back door. They asked me to come look, but they warned me beforehand that it was important. There were marks along the frame, deep ones. Someone had wedged a tool, maybe a flathead screwdriver or a crowbar, into the wood to try to pry the door open. The officer pointed out how the marks were old in some places and fresh in others. I frowned, confused, until he said, "These scratches weren't all from tonight." That didn't make sense at first. I had lived there almost a year.
I would have noticed something like that.
But when the officer shined his flashlight closer, I realized what he meant. Some of the scratches weren't sharp or clean. They were faded, like they'd been made weeks ago, maybe months. Like someone had been testing that door long before tonight. The officer asked if I'd ever had issues with break-ins before. I told him no. Not once. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face wasn't reassuring. Inside, they checked the windows. That's when they discovered the next thing. The one detail that made everything inside me go cold. A small section of dust on the windowsill in the hallway bathroom was disturbed. It looked like fingers had rested there. Not that night's fingerprints. Older ones. The officer asked how often I opened that window. I told him never. It had been painted shut since I moved in. He nodded slowly. "There's a chance someone opened it before you lived here." Before I lived there. The words hit harder than anything that had happened that night. They went through the attic next. I waited outside again because they said it wasn't safe for me to be up there. When the attic door finally pushed open, one officer called down to the others. He didn't shout. His voice was steady. But I saw the face of the officer next to me change. When they climbed down, they showed me what they found. A flattened patch of insulation, a few empty water bottles, and a small, old flashlight tucked behind one of the rafters. Someone had been staying up there. Not recently. The bottles were dusty, and the flashlight's batteries were corroded. But the officer said the insulation looked disturbed not too long ago. The idea settled in slowly, horrifyingly. Whoever broke in that night hadn't chosen my house randomly. They already knew it. They knew the layout. They knew the weak points. They knew exactly where to move without making noise. Because at some point, days, weeks, maybe even months before, they had already been inside. I didn't sleep in the house that night. I didn't even step back inside after the officers finished. One of them suggested I stay with a friend or a family member until I felt comfortable enough to return. I nodded, but the truth was, I already knew I wasn't coming back. Not to sleep. Not to live. Not for anything more than grabbing the rest of my things in daylight. While the officers packed up their equipment, I sat in the back of one of their cars with the door open, staring at my house. The same house that had felt so normal, so predictable, just a few hours earlier. Now it felt hollow in a way I can't explain, like the walls were hiding something I hadn't seen yet, something the police hadn't found. Before they left, one of the officers came over and stood beside me. He didn't try to comfort me. He didn't say anything unnecessary. He just told me they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night and keep my report open until they had more information. Whoever it was, he said, they're not likely to come back with the police involved. He meant it as reassurance, but it didn't land that way. He didn't say they couldn't come back.
Just that they were not likely to.
I ended up driving to my brother's apartment. He let me in without questions, but I could tell from the way he looked at me that he knew something was deeply wrong. I didn't tell him everything that night. I didn't have the energy to explain how long that person might have been around me without me knowing. I finally tried to sleep on his couch, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that slow, steady creak of the hallway floorboard again. The one you only step on if you know exactly where it is. The police called me the next afternoon. They said they reviewed the outside of the house in daylight and found more signs someone had been around the property. Shoe impressions near the back fence, scuff marks under one of the windows that shouldn't have opened, and a spot in the dirt beside the house where someone had been standing often enough to leave a shallow indentation. Could have been an old repairman or contractor, one officer said. But his tone didn't match the words. It was the kind of explanation you give when you don't want to scare someone further. Over the next week, I moved out. I didn't stay there alone again, not even for an hour. I grabbed boxes during the day while my brother waited outside in his truck. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. The house looked completely normal. But the last time I walked into the attic to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small section of insulation had been shifted again. Not a lot. Just enough that it wasn't the same as when the officers found it. It was a fresh disturbance.
New.
I stood there, staring at that patch of insulation, realizing it could have been moved any time in the last few days, maybe even the day before. Maybe even the morning I came back to pack. The police never found the man. They never figured out how long he had been watching my house, how long he had been inside, or why he picked mine. And even now, sometimes late at night, I still think about that attic. How quiet it was. How easy it would have been for someone to wait up there, listening, learning my routine, slipping down when they felt like it. The case is still open. And whoever he was,
He's still out there.